Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the seizure of Venezuelans Maduro and his wife, hauled out of bed in the early hours of Saturday by U.S. Special Forces, and now in a Manhattan federal prison, facing a 2020 indictment from the Southern District of New York on drugs and weapons charges. Joining us to discuss Trump's boast that we will run Venezuela is David Smilde, a professor of human relations and senior associate at the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research at Tulane University. He has published 5 books on Venezuela and lived in the country for over 33 years, living there for most of that time, and is the co-author of the new book, The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime and Policing During Chavismo. He's the author of the Substack, Venezuela and the United States, and we'll look into the Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine he calls the Monroe Doctrine, which has him threatening Greenland, Canada, Panama, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, while supporting right-wing authoritarian governments in Argentina, El Salvador, Honduras, Chile, and Ecuador, whose leaders like him, while spurning the Nobel Prize-winning leader of Venezuela's opposition in favor of keeping on Maduro's vice president to do his bidding, assuming she agrees. Then we'll assess the Trump oil grab of the world's greatest known reserves, which he crowed about at his press conference on Saturday, promising the Venezuelan people would benefit from a bonanza of investment from U.S. oil giants who will recover their, quote, stolen property and then pump, baby, pump. Joining us is Francisco Mondaldi, the fellow in Latin American energy policy at the Center for Energy Studies in the Mexico Center and the Latin American Initiative at the Baker Institute, as well as a lecturer in energy economics at Rice University. He's also the founding director and a professor at the Center for Energy and Environment at IESA in Venezuela, and previously was a professor of political economy at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Caracas. Then finally we'll speak with Nader Hashemi, the director of the Alawid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding and a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Edmund A. Wells School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. A non-resident fellow at Dawn, he's the author of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, and Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East, and we'll discuss Trump's threat that he is, quote, locked and loaded to rescue Iranian demonstrators from their brutal government as the country's economy craters under a crippling new round of U.S.-backed sanctions. Before we begin at the start of this new year of 2026, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, the already drunk with power Trump-Miller presidency will do anything to stay in power, which Trump has already demonstrated with his January the 6th, 2021 coup attempt against the United States Constitution. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they call communist lunatics. But this year, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in an era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To sustain us while Trump cowers the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, you can make tax-deductible donations at backgroundbriefing.org/donate and publictruthmedia.org to enable us to continue providing a daily news analysis program covering the major news stories 5 days a week on a very modest budget. We've recently expanded our production team from 2 people, that's me and Graham, to 5 employees to build up our podcast and social media presence, and we've hired a new Gen Z reporter to engage the future generation in a coalition of boomers and zoomers out to make America sane and decent again, as America's silent majority finds its voice in 2026 to save our 250-year-old democracy. And joining us now is David Smilde, a professor of human relations and senior associate at the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research at Tulane University. And he is the author of the Substack, Venezuela and the United States. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Smilde.
Thank you, Ian.
So Donald Trump has referred to the Monroe Doctrine as the Monroe Doctrine. and I'm sure he thinks that's amusing. But I'm not entirely convinced that he has the situation under control. Rubio apparently had a conversation with the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, in which she appeared to want to cooperate. But then she goes on national television and denounces U.S. imperialism and says we'll never bend to foreign invaders, etc. So where do things stand? What kind of Trump says we're going to run Venezuela, and he actually said that both Rubio and Hegseth would run the country, which is a frightening thought given that Hegseth bankrupted two small non-profits that he ran into the ground. So where do things stand? You're in touch with Venezuela. You have lots of contacts there. What are you hearing?
Well, what I'm hearing from people on the ground is just a lot of sort of wait and see and apprehension. I mean, I don't think anybody is lamenting the departure of Maduro. No, but people are very apprehensive about what's going to happen now. No, and the thing is, we don't know. That Trump was very clear about his intentions yesterday, that he sort of described them as having Delcy Rodriguez as their lady in Caracas, and clearly on board with sort of a neo-colonial situation. Then an hour or two later, we heard a press conference from Delcy Rodriguez with a very defiant tone, and basically repeating Maduro's line from the past 5 months, saying that we're willing to negotiate with the United States in terms of respect, and that this is an outrage, that Maduro needs to be released. And so it didn't seem consistent. What's not clear is whether she was playing to her base or those were really sort of the guiding words. But I think in general, what has happened with the U.S. with journalism and U.S. policymakers is that this discourse of Madurismo, or the Maduro government being a criminal government, just being a band of criminals that's masquerading as a state, really just misses the whole 25-year history of this movement. They really actually they are criminal and they are corrupt, but they do have this ideology, and the center of this ideology is that they were protecting Hugo Chavez's revolution, and the center of that revolution is that it's an anti-imperialist revolution. And so the idea that they're just going to say, okay, well now our best interests are in becoming a neo-colonial state. Sure, we're with the program. That's just not going to happen. No. And so this could be a very troubled relationship. We'll see. The Trump administration seems quite confident in it. And even we saw today the Federal Aviation Administration lifted the ban on flights in the Caribbean. So there's clearly no second wave of attack, in the short term planned. So we're going to have to see how this works out. Are they apparently Maduro had made this offer before that they're willing to give the U.S. privileged access to oil. Does the Trump administration want any more than that? No. Are they going to collaborate? I think there's just a lot of question marks.
Well, David, you'd have to be incredibly naive to think that Donald Trump cares about democracy. He already conducted a coup against American democracy and will do anything and everything he can to prevent democracy prevailing in the November elections of this year. And the fact that he's given the Nobel Prize winning leader of the Venezuelan opposition the back of his hand and basically dissed her in favor of Delcy Rodriguez indicates they don't care about democracy in Venezuela. At least that's my reading. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's been apparent for quite some time. I think there was a lot of wishful thinking. It's very understandable among the Venezuelan diaspora, among Venezuelan political activists, that Trump was the one person that sort of was interested in Venezuela and the Venezuelans and their plight. And a lot of people saw this as really considered this sort of responsibility to protect type intervention, that Trump was there trying to restore human rights and democracy in Venezuela. And it was a real bath of cold water yesterday when he said that Maria Corina Machado was not respected and that she couldn't be effective within the government. In fact, it was in the hours after that, in many of the different chats and the people I talked to, the first reaction was denial. No, it was like hearing bad news about a loved one. It was denial. People said, "Oh, Trump got confused. He must have said Delcy Rodriguez when he met Maria Corina Machado, and said Maria Corina Machado when he met Delcy Rodriguez. No, because saying that, oh, because he said, oh, we've had a good talk with Delcy Rodriguez, she's going to be in charge, and that, Maria Corina Machado is not respected. People thought, oh, he must just be confused. No, but of course, he wasn't confused. And within hours, it was clear that that was not the case, that he said what he meant. And so people are trying to assimilate that, and a lot of them still can't quite get their head around it. But they need to really make a lot of pressure right now and try to push Trump to and Rubio to push Venezuela to have some kind of opening, some kind of transition process, because otherwise this is just going to be about oil and resources. That's all that Trump really cares about.
So where do you think the role of Cuba is now? Because it's always been extraordinary, and I've talked to a lot of people in Venezuela about the paradox that Cuba, which is essentially a basket case, has always had an outsized influence over Venezuela. It's sort of like the tail that wags the dog, that the Presidential Guard, the Praetorian Guard, the protectors of Maduro are all Cuban intelligence from the DGA, along with the Cubans having influence, and they're monitoring, in effect, the Venezuelan military to make sure they're loyal to both Chavez and Maduro. And of course, Chavez saw Castro as his hero and his mentor. So did the U.S. knock out the Cuban influence? That's more or less what the Secretary of State Rubio is claiming.
Well, no, the only thing that the United States did was knock out a bunch of military installations and take Maduro and his wife. No, that's all, because the rest of the government is intact. No, they're a little bit shocked, and the military capacity certainly has been degraded, but that's about it. So there's a huge number of questions. What is the relationship with the military? What is the relationship with the base Chavistas, with the rest of the movement, the coalition, the Maduro coalition? And that goes for internationally as well. One is Cuba. What is the relationship with Cuba? I mean, this doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly there's no Cuban advisors there helping them. And there's some very astute Cuban advisors that have been helping the Maduro regime navigate the past many years. No, and that same thing goes with Russia and China. No, China and Russia have investments in Venezuela. China has investments. Are they just going to sit on their hands? No. And more tangibly, if the U.S.'s idea of controlling Venezuela is just having gunships off the coast and not boots on the ground, what are they going to do when some flights from China come in and flights from Russia, and China starts reinforcing its investments there, and Russia its military equipment? Is the U.S. just going to stay on their gunboats? Are they going to invade again? Are they going to try, or is this going to inevitably lead to boots on the ground? And those are huge questions. I mean, this is what many of us have been saying for months, that you don't, even if you want to do regime change, setting aside the international legality of that, you don't do that by just getting rid of one leader. No, it's a whole governing complex of people and discourses and relationships that is not just overcome by rendering the president of that country. It's much more complex than that.
Well, David, I tried to watch the cable news last night of endless footage of Maduro being dragged into the country and shackled, and comes off the plane and ends up in the federal prison facility in Manhattan. And the whole thing is such a farce, because Donald Trump freed one of the biggest drug dealers in history. He was the former president of Honduras, who was sentenced to 45 years, I think, or 54 years in a U.S. prison by none other than Emile Beauvais, the very guy that Trump promoted to the Court of Appeals. And this guy was returned to Honduras to help his party win the election, which looks like they stole. And this is a part of a broader issue here, which is really Trump's Monroe Doctrine, the idea that he wants to control the Western Hemisphere. And he's threatening Greenland, which is administered by a NATO country, Denmark. So that would mean the U.S. would be at war with NATO. At the same time, Supposedly, NATO is at war with Russia, uh, raising all kinds of questions about Trump's loyalty and Putin's hold on him. But if you go down the list, you've got his obsession with Greenland. He wants to take over Canada. And he's got all of these other countries in the Western Hemisphere that have right-wing pro-Trump leaders like Argentina, El Salvador, Honduras, Chile, and Ecuador. On the other hand, he's threatened Greenland, Canada, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, and tried to get Bolsonaro back into Brazil. The picture's pretty clear to me that that's what the broader frame isn't it?
Well, I think it's been very clear from the beginning that this is not about drugs. I mean, the idea that Venezuela is a main drug exporting transit nation is absurd. I mean, less than 10% of the drugs, and these are DEA figures, less than 10% of the drugs that come to the United States come through Venezuela. Most of the drugs that go through Venezuela end up in Europe. None of the fentanyl comes through. So this is not about drugs, no, which is not to say there's not drug trafficking, and not to say that's not a problem within Venezuela, just as it is through the entire region. No, but this is not what it's about. And pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez makes that evident. This is about Trump's vision, this sort of new national security strategy that he put forward. That's based on the Monroe Doctrine and the Trump corollary. It's an idea that the United States should be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere. So far, he's shown that this is about gunboat diplomacy, and it seems to be working towards resource imperialism. I mean, all of the places that he's kind of mentioning, Greenland, Venezuela, have natural resources or are highly strategic, like Panama. So this is kind of a return to 19th century American preeminence in the region based on military power and aiming at resources. They're not talking about a new block. I mean, it would be interesting if we talked about a new block of the Americas collaborating and cooperating on security and technology and economics, but that's not what he's talking about. He basically talks about Latin America in terms of immigrants, which for him means drugs and violence as well. Those three things all go together in his mind, and security and resources, and that's what it amounts to for him. And so yeah, I mean, the things he's done, it's very clear. It's not about democracy. It's not about rule of law. It's not about international institutions. It is about trying to have this preeminent American power that sort of extracts resources and gets what it wants, gets leaders that are friendly to it, that doesn't, jeopardize American control, American interests, and that's about it. I mean, the today in the New York, excuse me, the New York Times reported that one of the things that was sort of a tipping point for Trump was the fact that Nicolas Maduro was dancing on television. He would repeatedly dance and try to make light of the U.S. threats, and apparently that was too much because that's what he wants. He wants to have this sort of respect for U.S. military preeminence in the region, and it's really a lamentable sort of regression to 100 years ago in U.S. foreign policy.
Well, the press conference yesterday, what I witnessed was a pathological narcissist turning into a megalomaniac. I mean, he really is drunk with because he's a reality TV guy at heart. That's all he knows. Because he was never a billionaire. He became a billionaire on a phony TV show. So he's there talking about the videos that they watched, and you saw pictures of them. And by the way, Stephen Miller is the co-president. It's obvious. He's right there in the mix. And his wife just posted on X a picture of Greenland with the U.S. stars and stripes, imposed upon it. So he's the co-president. This is the Trump-Miller presidency, and it's a TV presidency. And he loved watching the video of the Delta forces capturing Maduro in his pajamas. But there's a reality outside of television, and that is the real world. And that's where we are today, isn't it? Just in closing here, because it seems to me that reality bites.
Yeah, I mean, I think We have a president that we've long known is a narcissist, and he is I think he is now the most powerful person in the world, and I think it was President Obama that once said that the position of the presidency, the power of the presidency, means that all your sort of personality defects come to their maximum, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing what happens when this kind of person is put into the most powerful position in the world and has had a lot of collaboration from Congress and the rest of the government in making sure that this is now the most presidentialist government we've ever had, administration we've ever had. They're trying to become more presidentialist and trying to sort of reduce all checks on his power. And this is the logical consequence of it. And I think we'll see more of this kind of situation. Behind this, as you suggest, is Stephen Miller. I mean, he is the advisor for Homeland Security, but he has been highly involved in this whole Venezuelan operation for a couple of things. I mean, he thinks that bombing these boats in the Caribbean and having tensions with Venezuela, having actual military conflict with Venezuela, is going to allow them to win their court case and be able to have license to use the Alien Enemies Act. And so we can expect in the coming weeks and months, we're going to have the Fifth District Court of Appeals in New Orleans say that, yes, the Trump administration can use the Alien Enemies Act, and they're going to use that. They'll probably use that to deport hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. That will be the saddest irony of all of this whole situation.
Well, David Smilde, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with David Smilde. He's the Professor of Human Relations and a Senior Associate at the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research at Tulane University. He's published 5 books on Venezuela and studied the country for over 33 years, living there for most of that time. And he's the co-author of the new book, The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime and Policing During Chavismo, and is the author of the Substack, Venezuela and the United States. We're going to take a brief station break and back assessing the Trump oil grab of the world's greatest known reserves, which he crowed about at his press conference on Saturday, promising the Venezuelan people would benefit from a bonanza of investment from U.S. oil giants who will recover their, quote, stolen property and then pump, baby, pump. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Francisco Mondaldi, who's a fellow in Latin American energy policy at the Center for Energy Studies in the Mexico Center and the Latin American Initiative at the Baker Institute, as well as a lecturer in energy economics at Rice University. He's also the founding director and a professor of the Center for Energy and Environment at IESA in Venezuela, and previously was a professor of political economy at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Caracas. Welcome to Background Briefing, Francisco Mondaldi.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And what are you hearing from Venezuela now? Because obviously on Saturday, President Trump basically said, one, that they've captured Maduro and his wife, and they've been sent to New York to be put on trial. But he also said that we are running the country. Also, at the press conference on Saturday, he mentioned, turned the mic over to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who he said had a conversation with the vice president, who nominally in charge, Delcy Rodriguez, and that she basically said, whatever you guys want, we'll do. So is Trump right in saying that he's in charge? I don't know how you can be in charge of a country when you don't necessarily have the boots on the ground.
Sure. So, of course, there is tons of uncertainty of exactly how this will shape up to go. But at the same time, it's evident by the fact that not only there seemed to be some sort of internal cooperation in the operation by how swiftly they were able to capture Maduro and his wife, but by the fact that the vice president seemed to be talking to the United States, that that they have a clarity about the fact that the U.S. has tremendous capacity to shape events from now on. So I would expect some degree of cooperation by the vice president and other members of the regime, or else they will, potentially face additional action by the United States. So that action, in which direction will they shape events? I think it's pretty uncertain at this point.
So a lot of what was discussed on Saturday was about oil, and President Trump was basically sending out an interesting mixed signal. On the one hand, he was saying, when he was asked about how do Russia and China feel about this, and he said, "Oh, we're just going to be making so much oil. We're going to be pumping so much oil. It's just going to be good for everybody. We'll be in charge of so much oil, we, the United States." And then he also said that the big American oil companies will go in there and they'll invest a lot of money. But he then also said that the Venezuelan people will be the beneficiaries of the revenues from the oil, which he said, has been squandered or misappropriated going back to Chavez. So where's the clarity there? I mean, if you're going to invest billions and into the oil, what Trump correctly said is decrepit and run down. On the other hand, who owns that oil? He's more or less saying we're going to be in charge, but at the same time saying, well, the Venezuelan people finally will benefit from this sort of national treasure that they have.
Sure. So, I mean, let me bring some facts into the picture. I mean, Venezuela produced about 3.4 million barrels of oil per day before Chavez came into power. Today, it produces about 1 million barrels, and there is the capacity, the resources to produce much more. How much more? It could be 4 or 5 times, but it will take a lot of time and a lot of investment. And the investment has to come from the private sector, because the Venezuelan national company is completely destroyed, and Venezuela owes more than $150 billion to all sorts of creditors, including some of the oil companies that were expropriated. In particular, the second largest creditor of Venezuela behind the Chinese at this point is Conoco, because that company was the biggest investor in Venezuela when the oil industry was partially nationalized, and they decided to leave the country and not accept the new conditions. The other major company that left was Exxon. Chevron, as you know, stayed in Venezuela, and therefore is very well positioned, to take advantage of a new regime and some, rules that make it attractive for foreign investors to invest. But of course, these will be decisions made by private companies, and they will decide depending on the operational situation, the institutional setting, including fiscal, contractual frameworks and the like, and the political stability, because these are, investments for the very long run, and you will have to have some, guarantees that the political risk will be limited. At the same time, Venezuela has a massive resource, has very low geological risk, and even though the infrastructure is in significant deteriorated, the different from other countries, there is a lot of spare infrastructure with some significant bottlenecks. But let me put it this way: outside of probably Iran, there is no other place in the world in which you could increase production by so much in the next few years, other than Venezuela.
But when President Trump says that essentially Maduro and company stole all of these assets, and these were the biggest investments lost by American companies, that's not quite the picture. There's an attempt to broker deals. You say that Chevron stayed, but Conoco and others. I thought there was a regime of compensation brokered either by the World Bank or the IMF. What actually happened there? Because I don't believe that it was outright theft, as President Trump claims.
Sure. I mean, this was a process of forceful renegotiation of contracts that, after the oil opening that happened in the 1990s in Venezuela with the previous administration to Hugo Chavez, Chavez forced companies to renegotiate contracts, and some were willing to accept the terms, some were not. Prominently, Conoco and Exxon did not, but for example, as I mentioned, Chevron, but also, Total from France, Eni from Italy, and others stayed in Venezuela. So these companies, both Exxon and Conoco, went to international arbitration, and they got these awards, these decisions that are binding, that Venezuela has to compensate them. In the case of Exxon, the compensation awarded was much smaller because they had smaller investments in the country, and also the decision was less favorable than the one that Conoco got. But today, as I mentioned, the biggest sort of award is to Conoco. So it's upwards of $10 billion. And so what Venezuela needs to do is basically compensate Conoco, as many other creditors, for their award. And of course, that will probably entail that Conoco would have to go back to Venezuela and invest in the oil sector, because otherwise it would be very hard for Venezuela to pay them back fully. But as I mentioned, it's mostly a decision from private actors deciding if they are willing to take the risks to invest in the country. And I think, of course, for Chevron, it's a pretty easy decision because they are already there. They already have the contracts. They just have to, take advantage of being the incumbents there. For others, is a tougher decision because they will have to bring fresh cash.
But isn't there an arrangement going back to before Chavez that this heavy crude that comes out of Venezuela was largely processed through refineries on the Texas Gulf Coast, I think some of which are owned by the Koch brothers, and that it's a sort of natural fit? So is that all going to be ramped up at this side? Because I'm trying to figure out why President Trump is saying that we're going to have all this oil. He didn't say the Venezuelans are going to have it all, although he did say they'll benefit from it. But we're going to have all this oil, and that China and Russia just going to have to accept it.
Well, Russia and China are in Venezuela. Chevron produces about 25% of Venezuela's oil currently. The national company at a little bit less than half. And the other two major players are the Russians and the Chinese, each with around 10% of Venezuela's production. But they haven't invested for a long, long time. But for example, in the case of the Russians, they do have some significant signed deals. And so we have to watch out for what happens to those deals. Regarding the Venezuelan oil, yes, the heavy oil of Venezuela is very well suited to be processed in the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, because there is a very large capacity to process this type of heavy oil. Remember that Mexico, for example, was also a provider of heavy oil. And so the refiners in that area made tremendous investments to process heavy oil. Outside of the US, the other countries that can process that kind of oil are basically India and China. So there is a natural fit there. Venezuela, at its peak, exported more than 1.5 million barrels of oil to the United States. By the time of US sanctions were imposed in 2019, they were exporting north of 500,000 barrels. And today they are Chevron is exporting to the U.S. about 140,000 barrels. So these refiners are eager, are thirsty for that type of oil. But of course, it will have to be, produced. And at this moment, probably very quickly, about 500,000 barrels of heavy oil could go to the United States. But to significantly increase production will require much more time and investment.
Well, it would seem, though, that China is going to get stiffed, aren't they? Didn't the Venezuelan government under both Chavez and Maduro borrow heavily against their oil reserves, borrow from the Chinese?
Yeah, I mean, over the years, China gave particularly to Hugo Chavez when he was in power, the largest amount of loans to any other country on earth, $62 billion. But most of it was repaid over the years with oil exports. Today, it's not transparent what is the balance. It seems to be around $10 billion, maybe a little bit more. And yes, that will be, I mean, the Chinese will be concerned if they will get their debt repaid. So far, as I mentioned, they do produce about 10% of Venezuela's oil. And of course, I think they will try to retain those assets in Venezuela. But they have been very hesitant over the last decade, particularly since Chavez died, of investing any money on Venezuela.
Well, it would seem that the biggest loser is Cuba here, because, first of all, Cuban intelligence, it was a strange situation where the tail was wagging the dog, that this tiny, almost failed state of Cuba, which has been under sanctions for decades, they basically kept that regime protected. And when the U.S. came in there on Friday night, that's who they shot up, was the Cuban guards that were protecting Maduro. And ever since the Russians pulled out of Cuba, Cuba's been getting free oil from Venezuela. I don't know that it's still happening, but you can assume now that with the U.S. in control, as Trump said, assuming that they are in control, and that's a big assumption, won't Cuba basically be cut off and it be even more vulnerable?
Definitely. I think Cuba and Russia are probably the biggest losers. In the case of Cuba, Cuba used to be the recipient of a lot of Venezuelan support, financial support, because during the Chavez time, Venezuela exported about 120,000 barrels per day to Cuba, and Cuba only needed about 60. They consume about 80, they produce about 20, and Venezuela was giving them significantly more. And that surplus they re-exported. So not only they got a very cheap supplies of oil, but they also were able to monetize that surplus. After the collapse of the oil price in 2014 and the collapse of Venezuela's production that happened afterwards, Venezuela reduced significantly their shipments to Cuba because they were desperate to get more cash from the oil exports. So the last year or so, the figure was more around 30 to 40,000 barrels per day. And Mexico, particularly Pemex, the national company of Mexico, became a relevant provider of Cuba. But in the last few months, the U.S. government pressured Pemex not to continue doing that in the same amount. So we have to watch for the development on that front. And certainly, if Venezuela does not export any more oil to Cuba, that will be a major, major blow, because the electricity generation in Cuba is heavily dependent on oil. And so we have to watch out if the Mexicans cover for that, or maybe the Russians. But it would be a really tough time for Cuba. And of course, given that Secretary Rubio has been driving a lot of the policy towards Venezuela, one would expect that he will use now the influence that he has in this matter to pressure the Cuban regime, which is another objective that he has had for a long time.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, apparently Rubio did have a conversation with the vice president of Venezuela, who apparently she said, anything you guys want. So we just don't know how this transition is going to happen. And it looks as if Cuba's hold over that country is being shattered because the Praetorian Guard was basically Cuban intelligence. And I assume that those are the people that were targeted. So it seems like a very unstable situation. And I have to mention, though, Francisco, just in closing here, there's an awful irony here when you talk about freeing a country from a drug-dealing regime at the same time that President Trump freed the former president of Honduras, who's now back in Honduras, who was guilty of importing something like 400 to 500 tons of cocaine into the United States. So the justification of taking down a regime based upon it being a bunch of drug dealers is pretty shaking.
Yeah, certainly there it has been a moving target, the justification for the policy towards Venezuela. And I think that Secretary Rubio has been the one that has had as objective what we saw today. And, he has aligned other players within the administration through different arguments that sometimes are emphasized, one is emphasized versus another, but it has been mostly a political sort of decision of how this rhetoric has been played out.
Well, Francisco Mondaldi, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Francisco Mondaldi, who's a fellow in Latin American energy policy at the Center for Energy Studies in the Mexico Center and the Latin American Initiative at the Baker Institute, as well as a lecturer in energy economics at Rice University. He's also the founding director and a professor at the Center for Energy and Environment at IESA in Venezuela, and previously was a professor of political economy at Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Caracas. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into Trump's threat against the Iranian regime, saying he's locked and loaded to rescue Iranian demonstrators from their brutal government.
And it means simply that authorities and members of the police force no longer have to knock on your door before entering. They can now knock your door down. It's no knock. You explained it to me, I must admit, but just for the record, you were talking long rap about no knock being legislated for the people you've always hated in this hellhole that we call home. No knock, the man will say.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Nader Hashemi, the director of the Alawid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding and a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Edmund A. Welsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, a non-resident fellow at Democracy for the Arab World Now. He's the author of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, and Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. Welcome to Background Briefing, Nader Hashemi.
Thanks, Ian.
So in the last few days, Donald Trump has made threats against the Iranian leadership, saying if they crack down on and kill and hurt demonstrators, that he's locked and loaded and will come to the rescue of Iranian people who are being persecuted and murdered by their government. And it's no question that the only reflex that government has whenever its people rise up against them, going back to the Green Movement that you wrote about, is just increase force and be ruthless. So now that he's captured Maduro and his wife in Venezuela, what do you think the leadership in Iran are thinking at the moment, particularly the IRGC and the Supreme Leader?
Well, I think they're following these developments very closely. The protests that broke out are very serious protests, and they don't have any quick solutions because they're rooted in, deep-rooted, widespread corruption, mismanagement, cronyism, which has always been a feature of Iranian politics. But fundamentally, these protests are a function of severe external sanctions that the United States has placed on Iran. And there's no chance of having those sanctions lifted unless there's some sort of diplomatic negotiation. That ship has largely sailed. Your listeners might recall that over the summer, Iran was involved in negotiations with Donald Trump over Iran's nuclear program. But then it seemed like Netanyahu convinced Donald Trump to bomb Iran in June, produced a 12-day war. The United States got involved, bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, and things have sort of deteriorated from that point on. So I think the Iranian senior leadership are watching these developments very closely. They're very worried about the internal stability of the country. They know that these protests are genuine, they're deep-rooted, they're legitimate grievances. The currency has collapsed, inflation is over 70%. People literally can't put food on the table. So the protests are legitimate, but of course, at the end of the day, this is a regime that has lasted for 45 years. They're deeply entrenched in society, and they're not going to give up power, without a brutal fight. They have a track record of suppressing protests, as they did, 3 years ago when you had, a major uprising that was a function of, repressing the basic rights of women to walk into the streets of Iran, known as the Women Life Freedom Protests. And so, all of these things that I think are, on the minds of Iran leaders. And then the question in Venezuela, the fact that the United States was able to project power and effectively kidnap the head of state of another country without much difficulty has probably sent alarm bells ringing in Tehran. I don't think the United States can pull off something like that in the context of the Islamic Republic of Iran. One, because it's a much stronger regime. And something like that, I think, would just not be, physically possible. But I think it's rattled. It's going to put the country on a war footing, because we saw that Donald Trump did bomb Iran over the summer. He's threatened to do it again, and so it's going to bring the country to, to a war footing, which it is right now. There's no chance of diplomacy, and so all of this sort of produces a situation that is extremely volatile and extremely unpredictable. Of course, at the end of the day, unfortunately, it's going to be the Iranian citizens who are going to pay the price, because they have very little international support. They're living under a brutal regime that has a track record of extreme repression, and I think we're going to just have to watch how this whole situation unfolds. The tragedy of the situation in Iran right now is that there's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no sort of sense of optimism that there could be a diplomatic breakthrough. There could be a successful internal mobilization within Iran to produce a democratic transition. So this is just characterizes our contemporary world, Ian. It's a dark moment everywhere, and you have a very unpredictable and I would argue also irrational president running the most powerful country in the international system, who, just watching him a moment ago, today on Saturday, roughly at around, noontime, Donald Trump has, made this dramatic announcement. Not only has he kidnapped the head of state of Venezuela, but he's announcing, to everyone's shock and surprise, that the United States is going to be running Venezuela. How he's going to do that without a major projection of American troops in Venezuela remains to be seen. I mean, removing the president is one thing, but actually, presiding over an orderly transition without the presence of American troops in Venezuela raises fundamental questions about how Donald Trump seeks to, occupy Venezuela. And this, of course, all flies in the face of his rhetorical flourishes when he was running for president, that he wants to end U.S. wars abroad. It seems like the exact opposite is happening under this president.
So at that press announcement on Saturday, Trump also referred back to Jimmy Carter's aborted rescue attempt and, of course, to Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, saying that's never going to happen, not under my watch. So he spent a lot of his time telling how great he is, which is what he does all the time. But nevertheless, I think throughout the country, probably most people think this is a win. I think a lot of the Venezuelan people may think it's a win. I don't, as you point out, nothing similar could happen in Iran. He did also mention on Saturday about him bombing, ending their nuclear program. So what happened in his recent meeting at Mar-a-Lago with Netanyahu? Is that in any way connected to his statements about being locked and loaded, ready to help the Iranian people? I don't know how you help the Iranian people by bombing the place, but maybe he has something in mind. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think the meeting in Mar-a-Lago with Netanyahu is a cause of deep concern because the last time those two leaders met in the context of Iran, we saw it led to a 12-day war in the Middle East that almost brought the region to the precipice of a broader regional war. And Netanyahu, for at least 30 years, has been claiming that, Iran is the biggest threat facing humanity. And if we don't take that regime out, there won't be a world left to live in. So that's to be expected from Netanyahu. The question is, will Donald Trump take the bait once more? And now that he's already bombed Iran once again, and it was relatively a cost-free bombing, I can easily see that scenario reproducing itself. And so there's a lot to be concerned about because, it's easy to bomb Iran. If Iran chooses to respond then by, let's say, hitting tankers in the Persian Gulf or bombing American military assets in the region, that will be an escalation, and it's unclear how this will end. So we're dealing, I think, here with a moment in history, Ian, that it seems like where international law and the international so-called rules-based order no longer exists. This strikes me as a 19th century moment of international gangsterism where might makes right, and Donald Trump feels that if he wants to take over Greenland, he can do so. If he wants to kidnap the head of state of another country, even if that head of state is a brutal dictator, he can do so. And there's no one there who's able or willing to stop him. My sense is just watching the reaction from Europe and from other countries, there's deep fear that if you say anything critical of Donald Trump, he's going to impose 50% tariffs on your country. And there's a sense of, this completely unpredictable leader in charge of the most powerful state in the international system, able to do whatever he wants, and no one can put any obstacles in his way. So I think we're in a very dangerous moment here. It also sets a very bad precedent for future international relations, because if Donald Trump can kidnap Nicolas Maduro and take him to the United States, what's to prevent Vladimir Putin from kidnapping Zelensky in Kyiv and taking him to Moscow and claiming that we're doing this for our own national security? What leg will the United States have to stand on if something like that happens? So we're in a very dangerous world, and it just, I think, characterizes this very dark and unpredictable moment in international affairs.
But the other side of the coin, though, Nader, is that a lot of people will argue, and presumably this will come from the Venezuelan people themselves, that they're being liberated from a terrible government. So the question is, how do you liberate the Iranian people from this really disgusting government that's so mismanaged now? Of course, sanctions have turned the screws and helped wreck the economy, but the Bazaris now have joined in with the people. You've had the women rise up earlier. You can go back to the Green movement that you wrote about as well. These people have been trying to free themselves from this horrible religious kleptocracy for decades now. So how can that be accomplished? Because that ought to be the goal, right?
I agree. No, I agree. That's a great question, Ian. And I think by threatening to bomb a country and by starving a population that you're claiming you want to support, that doesn't create ripe social conditions that can produce democratic change. So one of the tragedies of U.S. policy toward Iran is that this policy of extreme punitive sanctions have effectively impoverished Iranians, specifically the middle class. There's a really good recent article in the European Journal of Political Economy that sort of looks at the question of sanctions in Iran. And they basically make a very convincing argument using a lot of data that the predictable consequences of U.S. Sanctions policy is that it has produced mass poverty and mass pauperization, targeting specifically Iran's middle class. And this is the middle class that was at the core of the Green movement, was at the core of the Masa Amini uprising 3 years ago. You can't seriously consider the prospects for democratic change when people are struggling to put food on the table. Those two things don't go together. So the strategy that I was very much in favor of was a strategy that sort of goes back to the Obama administration. I was a strong proponent and supporter of the nuclear deal that was negotiated between Barack Obama and the Iranian regime in 2015, known as the JCPOA. It was an agreement that had the support of literally the entire world. It resolved a major issue between the two countries, and it created a sort of a pathway and a set of circumstances that could gradually lift the sanctions on Iran, allow the Iranian middle class to breathe again, which will then create better internal social conditions where people could organize and fight for their freedom. I think that's the only way forward. If you believe in supporting, people who are struggling for their freedom, you have to sort of first of all listen to what they're telling you, and you have to sort of think about, the relationship between economic sanctions and the struggle for democracy. And when people are, starving, when people can't put food on the table, it's very difficult for them to then, think about, political organizing that can challenge an authoritarian regime. So that's the pathway that I think, we have to think about it. Anyone who thinks that by bombing Iran, that you can simply try and decapitate this regime is, I think, completely misguided. The regime in Iran, unfortunately, does have a small but very sort of a robust base of support. It's a small percentage of the population, and they're not going anywhere, and they have the guns. And so one has to sort of think about, I think, much more creative ways of supporting, the struggle for democracy in Iran. And these threats of intimidation, of, assassination, and critically of starvation, which is effectively what the consequences of this sanction policy have produced, are not conducive to creating social conditions that can help the Iranian people free themselves from this brutal regime that rules over them.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Nader, what motivates the Basij and the Pasdaran and the IRGC and these repressive tools that the government has is religion. In other words, they think, as they beat up women and students and anybody that protests, that they are doing that because God told them to, because God speaks directly to the supreme leader. So how do you break that spell?
Well, I think you have to see, if you follow these questions of democratic transitions and how authoritarian regimes are toppled, you have to look at several factors. One is splits within the ruling political establishment. You have to try and foster divisions among the ruling elite, that the current status quo is untenable and that there is no longer unity of purpose among the ruling political class that is in control. That's something that you have to try and foster. You also have to try and persuade the security forces that maintaining the status quo is not in their interest, that this is a political system that has lasted now almost 50 years. It has proven to be politically bankrupt and economically bankrupt. So you have to try and sort of create sort of opportunities to sort of, sway people away from maintaining the status quo. Those are difficult things. And then critically, you need unified opposition. Unless you have a unified opposition that can sort of coordinate strikes, that can bring people out into the streets with clear demands, then it's going to be very difficult to sort of challenge a deeply entrenched political system. When it comes to Iran, I think the internal conditions for political change in Iran are ripe for political change. What's not ripe is the external and international conditions. Threats of an external intervention, bombing, regime decapitation, that always plays into the hands of national security arguments that support, more conservative opinion within any country that's facing a political crisis. So I think if there's that's why I was so supportive of the Obama administration's policy, because it removed the threat of external attack on Iran, and it created more ripe internal conditions for political change. So those are things that Iranians are going to have to figure out. But anyone who thinks that you can solve the problem of authoritarianism in Iran by simply sort of, taking out the supreme leader or bombing a few targets here and there, that's wishful thinking. That's not how political change is going to happen in Iran. In fact, it's going to probably embolden the regime, because then they can play the card of They can rally people around the flag. They can claim that we're under threat by these imperial forces. They can distract people from internal regime incompetence and corruption and point to the external enemy that is trying to subjugate, Iranians, as the West has done for much of Iran's modern history. So that's not the plan that I would advise anyone to pursue if you're seriously interested in bringing about and supporting democratic change within Iran.
Well, Nader Hashemi, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Ian, for the opportunity.
And again, I've been speaking with Nader Hashemi, who's the director of the Alaouite Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding and a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, a non-resident fellow at Democracy for the Arab World Now. He's the author of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, and Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.